Routing and Switching, Chapter 7, DHCP IPv4, and this is an overview of the chapter. What are we going to do in this chapter? Well, we're going to look at the way that you can get IPs automatically assigned from a DHCP server to a client, how to do some config for both the server and client, and then the concepts behind DHCP. The purpose of DHCP is to hand out IP addresses, which is less overhead, less admin, more simple time. Typically it does it from a server. A server can be a PC, it can also be a router. What are the processes to get an IP address? Well, they're called DORA. There's a discover, an offer, a request, and then there's the acknowledge at the end. So who discovers? Well, the client's going to send out a broadcast address. That's going to be both a 255 layer 3 IP and a FF layer 2 MAC address. And it's searching the network for a DHCP server. When the DHCP server picks that up, it's going to offer an address. At this point in time, the client still doesn't have an IP. It's just been given one. This offers it from something called a pool, which is a list sequential IP addresses. And the offer is a unicast address because it knows what the MAC address through the switch of the LAN segment, where it got it, where it was sourced from, so it can return this packet. The client will now request the address so that it will take it out of the pool. And the tricky part of this is a broadcast. Why a broadcast? Well, you can have multiple DHCP servers. So as this is becoming a broadcast, this will let this server know that that IP has been taken out of the pool, so it doesn't give it to another device. And then the last is the acknowledgement. And what the acknowledgement does is it takes the IP away, it puts a lease on it with the MAC address, and it still sends it, but this time it sends it and the computer then binds it and can use it. Can you renew a release? If you need to renew it, it will just send a request and an acknowledgement. Now that can happen automatically as the client IP runs out of its date and time expiry. It will just check that there's no problem with renewing the IP. Very rarely is there a problem, and it will then restamp the time on that IP address from the pool. You can go and do the short quiz. Can you set up a Cisco device as a DHCP server? You can set up the router to hand out addresses, and it hands them out on the interface to any device on the LAN or the network that's attached. You type in the excluded addresses. Now they're going to be reserved. It might be that you have a static address for a server, so you don't hand that out. You exclude obviously the gateway address, so you don't get any duplicates or confusion. And sometimes you put a range in your excluded for in case you add other things that you want to have static addresses to, printers, etc. You type in a pool name, and then you configure the pool. Syntax, IP DHCP excluded address is done first. IP means IPv4. when you type in IP DHCP pool, and then you put a word in here for the name, then you go into the DHCP. Interestingly, the DHCP excluded are not in the DHCP config. So make sure you know that little difference. What are the things you type in? The network and the mask. So if we look at an example, if this is a 10 network, we'd type in 192.168.10.0, 255.255.255.0 as our network. The default router is the gateway address. So for us, we'd type in IP default router 192.168.10.1. And that's the way that this device knows how to the router knows how to hand out addresses from which interface. So the 10 pool will be handed out this way, and the 11 will be handed out on the gig 001, which is what the default router is attaching the pool to where it wants to go. Very common is you bind your DHCP to your DNS information. That way you can have lookup names talking to IPs. And you want to know where your DNS server is so that you can do those lookups. So you get a binding inside your DHCP. So as your DHCP comes through, the DNS information is inside your DHCP request. You can have a domain name, lease, days, hours, minutes, or forever. And then if you've got old equipment, you can run NetBIOS and Wins. DHCP has superseded these processes. So here's an example. You type in your excluded addresses to begin with, and here we've got a range from 1 to 9. If the address falls outside the range, you're going to have to put it in individually. You can't have spaces in your name, and you set your pool up, which takes you to DHCP mode. You put in your network, your gateway, so it knows which side to hand out the addresses that are attached to this network. Your DNS server, so you can bind your IP information and do lookups. And you can put a domain name in. You can do your show running config, which will show you the actual information set here. You can show a binding, and you can show the service statistics. So what is a binding? A binding is an address which is logical to a physical address, and it has the lease. This is the way you can check to see how many have been handed out, or if you get any suspicious activity where these addresses don't match any of your MAC addresses and you've been flooded using an attack at layer 2. Statistics is again how many pools, how many bindings. So if you're not getting any numbers in here, then your DHCP is faulty. And you can do a verification, doing a show. If you don't want to run your DHCP anymore, you can turn your service off or on. What is relay? Well, if your DHCP server is not on your LAN segment and it's not being handed out locally, you can put an address. Now, where do you place the address? This is what you get tested in Cisco on a lot. You put a helper address on your client side of your network, which means when you get a broadcast, the helper address is on the router interface gig 0. The routing information knows where to look up, and in this case, it'll go this way into this LAN. You could have many, obviously, you could have many networks attached. If you go and draw some more networks out here, you've got an IP helper address that will say, I know where to send you. You're not going to go out there. You're not going to go out there. I'll send you into here. And when it gets into here, because it's a 67 address, which is saying I'm looking for a server, this comes here and says, I'm a DHCP server. Yes, I can get you an address. And because you've come from this network, I know to look at you in this pool because it might have multiple pools here. So they're different networks. So it'll find that and then it can route back because it has a source and destination. Some of the commands that you will possibly need to look at is release and renew to show how the DORA works. The helper address is on an interface and it's pointing to the device where you want to go, and here it's 11.6. So it sits on here and it points this way. And then the routing is what happens with the IP. If you do a show interface, you can show the helper address information there. And if you've got an IP config all, it can show you the information of the IPs. What other services are broadcast? Interestingly, a helper address is not just for DHCP. There are two options with DHCP, our server and our client, but it can also do a helper for a DNS, TACACS, which is a log-on process of security on Cisco, which is username and password credentials, trivial file, so if you need to go and do file transfer and you don't have as much information as required, you can forward the information. And NetBIOS is an old way to do names to addresses, and it's been taken over by BootP DHCP. You'll need to recognize there are many, and I think there's 8 because you'll be tested on that. There's a short video on how to do the config of DHCP for IPv4. It also includes how to set up your router as a client. Typically that's ISP based. What that means is this is handing out addresses and you can get your address for your client. Small office, home office. Sometimes that's Wi-Fi, so you can get clients in a cafe or a hotspot. It just makes it very, very simple and easy. And again, you get tested on the logic of why you'd want your router to have an address from a client and it's not static, because it just hands them out as you need to based off your connection. How do you set up your router? You go onto the interface that you want DHCP to get and you ask for DHCP. And here's a overview of how you can set those things up with the syntax in it. You can do a packet tracer to implement DHCP v4. And here's the summary for this chapter.